Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Harbour Midweek Mini. I hope you're well. Thanks for joining me today for part 2 of the Gospel according to Jeremiah 33. Last week I tried to give you a bit of a historical overview of the chapter, and I made the case for it as being one of the last chapters before the city of Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians. And why I'm really interested in this chapter is because it's a really good example of a chapter that has the gospel embedded in it, hidden away in it. And we're going to explore this in a bit more detail today. But what I wanted to try and achieve last week, I suppose, was point out that although it's a positive, overall it's a very positive chapter and has some really positive things to say, it's actually taking place at a point of absolute crisis, a real bleak moment in the history of the kingdom of Judah. The Babylonians are besieging the city, they're at the walls are about to be broken through, there's famine in the city, atrocities are being committed within the city, there's disease and there's death, and the prophet himself, he's locked up, and he's in the courtyard of the guard. He can't go about the city, he can't escape, and in fact he's about to suffer an attempt on his life. But it's within that context of crisis, within that context of disaster and judgment, that these words are spoken out by Jeremiah. And verses 2 and 3 say this. This is what the Lord says. He who made the earth, the Lord who formed it and established it, the Lord is his name. Call to me and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. And in some ways they're strange verses to understand in this context, but it's almost like God is hinting at something. He's hinting at the fact that despite the crisis that had come upon the city and upon the kingdom, despite all that was unfolding and all that was about to happen, he still had a plan. He still had a future for his people. And he's inviting Jeremiah and his listeners to ask him to reveal these unsearchable things. And I think in some ways chapter 33 represents an unfolding or a revelation of some of these unsearchable things that God is hinting at. Just one very quick reminder as well that we have to understand when reading the Old Testament prophets that normally the prophecies themselves really operate at different levels, or within different time zones, might be a better way of putting it. What we see is there are really 3 types of time zone that the Old Testament prophets speak into. First of all, they speak into what I call the near future. So they speak about events that are going to happen imminently or within the next few years, within a few centuries at most. And I read this verse last week, but verse 4 is a good example of that near future type of prophecy. It says, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says about the houses in this city and the royal palaces of Judah that have been torn down to be used against the siege ramps and the sword. And he goes on to say that they're going to be full of dead bodies. So he's prophesying about something that would happen within the next few months. And indeed it does happen. And that's an example of a near future prophecy. But we also see in the prophets, we see what I call distant future or end time prophecies that are very specific to the events that unfold at the very end of human history as we know it. And in terms of the Old Testament prophets, they generally concern the events that unfold in and around Jerusalem and in what was the kingdom of Judah. And again, we see an example of this in Jeremiah 33 as well. Verse 6 says, nevertheless, I will bring health and healing to it, that's the city. I will heal my people and will let them enjoy abundant peace and security. And it begins to describe in this chapter, it begins to describe this moment in history when there will be a restoration for those that believe in God. There will be a restoration for those that trust in God. And it goes on further in verses 12 and 13 to describe a sort of bucolic future, which we see a lot in the prophets. But for example, verse 12, it says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says in this place. Desolate and without people or animals, in all its towns, there will again be pastures for shepherds to rest their flocks." So this is an example of a far off, a distant future prophecy, an end time prophecy. And as I've just mentioned, there are also these examples of near future prophecies. But there's this third category of prophetic literature that we find in all of the Old Testament prophets concerning this, what I call the Messianic era. And these prophecies concern the coming of this mysterious figure, who we of course know is Jesus, but the coming of this mysterious figure, the Messiah, who will, amongst other things, save his people from their sins. And what we find slap bang in the middle of Jeremiah 33 is this incredible messianic prophecy that isn't really spoken about much. I don't think I've ever heard anyone speak about this prophecy, but it's a very strong, clear promise concerning the coming of a king. And it's found in verses 14 to 16, and I shall read it. "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill the good promise I made to the people of Judah, to the people of Israel and Judah. In those days and at that time I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line. He will do what is just and right in the land. In those days Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will live in safety. This is the name by which it will be called, the Lord our righteous Saviour." And what's interesting is if you go back to look at Jeremiah 23, the exact same prophecy appears there, almost word for word. You can go back and have a look at that. So this is an important prophecy in the writings of Jeremiah. And the first thing to say about this prophecy is that it concerns a coming king. And in the context of the book of Jeremiah, this is really significant, because I tried to mention a little bit about this last week. Really, the prophecies of Jeremiah concern the royal house of David, and they concern the kings of Judah, and in particular they concern the ends of the things that happened at the end of Josiah's reign and the reigns of his children, who I told you last week, 3 of whom sat upon the throne of Judah, all of whom were wicked. So in essence, what Jeremiah is about, yes, it's about the fall of Babylon, but really in essence the book of Jeremiah is about the fall of the crown. It's about the fall of the royal house of David, or the seeming fall of the royal house of David. And this is at the heart of what this passage is really talking about, and God is speaking to Jeremiah about. Because I'm sure you're familiar with this idea of the Davidic covenant. Back in the book of 2 Samuel, David decides he's going to build a temple for the Lord. He's not allowed to do it. God says his son will be able to do it. And God sends Nathan the prophet to David and tells David that his throne will be an everlasting throne. And in verse 16 of 2 Samuel 7 it says, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." This is the Davidic covenant. This is an important moment in the Old Testament. God tells David his throne will last forever. And yet, here we are in 586 BC, and it's looking like the throne of David is crumbling. Zedekiah, the last king, he's actually planning his escape from Jerusalem. And in fact, when the Babylonians do break through, he does a runner with his sons. He's captured, he's taken with his sons to this place called Riblah in what is modern day Lebanon. He's brought before the king of Babylon, where he's encamped, and his sons are executed before him, and Zedekiah's eyes are put out. The last thing he sees effectively was the murder of his sons. So that essentially is the end of Zedekiah's rule. He's taken to prison and he dies in prison. And to all intents and purposes, it looks as if the covenant that God spoke to David has been cancelled. It's been finished. That God has failed to keep his promise to David because of the sin of the people. But in fact, this isn't the case. And I don't know if you remember last week I mentioned chapter 21. And in chapter 21, which I believe is the chapter that precedes Jeremiah 33, Jeremiah delivers a prophecy to, quote, the royal house of Judah. And it says, I'll read it to you because it's significant. It says, "Moreover, say to the royal house of Judah," this is verse 11, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says to you, house of David. Administer justice every morning, rescue from the hand of the oppressor, the one who has been robbed, from the oppressor, the one who has been robbed, or my wrath will break out and burn like fire because of the evil you have done. Burn with no one to quench it." And Jeremiah is warning the royal house of David, of whom Zedekiah was the current king, to act justly. And in fact, it seems like an odd moment for this prophecy to be delivered to Zedekiah because he's not going to change his ways. And in fact, even if he tried, it would be too late. Everything had been set in motion. Nothing was going to change. Why then did Jeremiah give this prophecy to Zedekiah? You can look it up and think about it. But I think it's a reminder that the promise given to David was conditional. It's a really important point that when God promised David that his throne would last forever, there were some conditions. And these are what David tells his own son. When David's on his deathbed, he tells Solomon, and he says these words in 2 Kings 2 verse 4, "If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel." And so the prophecy of Jeremiah 21, not to confuse things, but I think is relevant, is a reminder that God expected the one who would sit upon the king of Judah, sit upon the throne of Judah. There was an expectation that he would act justly and he would act faithfully. And something, of course, that all of the kings from the time of Josiah till the fall of Babylon, all of them failed to do. No one acted justly. So when we go back to look at the Messianic prophecy in verse 15, it says, "In those days and at that time, I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line. He will do what is just and right in the land." This is a reference to the fact that this coming king will be a righteous king, that he will sit upon David's throne rightfully, and that he will be just and he will be faithful. And of course we know that that's Jesus. So I think this is amazing. Despite all that was unfolding, despite the bleak scene, despite the imminent fall of the crown, despite the imminent destruction of Zedekiah's heirs, God was making it clear that somehow he was going to cause a king to come from David's line, and that king would be a rightful heir, and that he would be a righteous king who would do what is just and right in the land, and that he would be the one who was worthy to sit on David's throne and fulfill the promise spoken to David. And of course, Jesus, we know, was a descendant of David. And in fact, on his mother's side, it's just an interesting point. On his mother's side, if you look at Luke 3 and the genealogy of Jesus there, you can see that Jesus' ancestry goes back to David directly, but it doesn't actually come through Solomon, but it comes through a different son of David, Nathan, not to be confused with the prophet. And in fact, in the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Matthew, we see, which is his adopted family line, if you like, it does go back to Solomon. It's just a thought, and it's just an aside, that Jesus actually came naturally, biologically, from David through his mother, but not in the same way that Zedekiah had, and that line had actually been cut off from the kingship. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. So you can see that there's a bigger thing going on here, that this idea of the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant, which seemed to be in jeopardy because of all that was happening, in fact was God had already had a plan. It's like one of his great and unsearchable things. There was already a plan for a king to come from David's line through a route that no one had expected. And in fact, to finish, it does talk about this righteous branch sprouting from David's line. And I like how in the NIV they put a capital B every time they mention these branch prophecies. But in fact, in the Hebrew, it doesn't have, there were no capitals. So this word for branch, sema, it's used not just in the book of Jeremiah, but it's used in the book of Isaiah, and it's also used in the book of Zechariah to describe the coming Messiah. He's described as a branch, and I sort of feel that there's a double meaning here, because if you think about a family tree, then we think of the branches of a family, and what the writer is saying, what God is saying through Jeremiah, he's saying that there will be a line of David, a branch of the family tree of David, from which the king will come, and it will be a righteous branch, and that branch will be the one who bears fruit. And of course, that is also the image, and the idea of a natural branch sprouting on a tree, coming forth from a tree, as being the one who will bear the fruit of the kingdom. And this was an image that was used, particularly in the book of Isaiah, that the kingdom of Judah was like a tree that was going to be cut down. And in fact, this is exactly what was happening in 586. This was the moment that Isaiah prophesied, when the tree would be completely cut down and that there would only be a stump left in the land. But from that stump, very famously, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. And the idea is that out of the devastation and the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem, somebody would come, the Messiah would come, who would save his people from their sins. So that's it. The bottom line is, Jeremiah 33 tells us that despite the destruction of the kingdom of Judah and the end of the crown of Zedekiah and his descendants, despite all that happening, God had a plan. He was sending a king who would be still from the line of David, and the covenant God made with David would be fulfilled. And I think one last thing to just mention, I should have mentioned this before, but it says back in verse 14, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill the good promise I made to the people of Israel and Judah." And the promise that God made to the people of Israel and Judah was to give them a king, and to give them a throne that would last forever. And I love the fact that it includes both Israel and Judah, because just as David reigned over a united kingdom, so the coming Messiah would one day reign over a united kingdom. And that returns to that bucolic image of a restored people in a restored land, in a restored world, that the Messiah will bring about when he comes for a second time. So that's it. I realise I'm going through a lot of information there, but hopefully you followed. Next week we're going to be looking at the other aspect of this passage, the third thing I wanted to talk about, which is really exciting, and it concerns the coming of a new covenant and its relationship with the old. We've already seen that there's a lot about the covenant with David in this passage, but there's other covenants that are being spoken about, and we're going to be uncovering a really important theological truth, a really important one, which I won't tell you about now. So next week you can tune in and find out about that. So I hope that was helpful. Be in touch if you have any questions or thoughts, and thanks for watching. God bless you, and see you soon.